All right. Welcome to the Dom Watkins Show. I am your host, Dom Watkins. So, I want to spend some time this week talking about the work that I've been doing on the last section of the book, a section titled Nurture Your Soul. And before I do that, just need to pull up. I know that some of you sent in questions, which I'm going to try to get to. So, the way that this section originally arose, and I think it informed a lot of how I was thinking about this book from the beginning, was I heard a talk by my friend Lisa Van Dam called Literature and the Quest for Meaning. And this was a few years ago that she gave at the Ayn Rand Institute's annual summer conference. And it was one of the most powerful, moving talks ever. And I remember having the thought, so much of the barrier to people getting the power of the objectivist ethics is that they see it through the lens of like Gordon Gekko, Donald Trump, like money, material values is kind of the essence of life. And though we definitely ought not back away from the fact that like material values, they're valuable, they're things worth striving for, that the real cash value of and a real selling point of the objectivist ethics is the fact that great art is at the center of pursuing happiness. Now, this section is wider than art, which I'll talk about, but it was that basic insight that kind of propelled how I was thinking about the book. That in order to actually get people to see the cash value of the philosophy, you had to go wider than kind of the obvious points in ethics and really bring in some of the unique factors that really stand out in terms of how Ayn Rand teaches us to think about the quest for happiness. So I definitely recommend check out Lisa's talk. It's on YouTube. It's amazing. But when I was first envisioning this section, the way I originally had it was I gave the outline last time, which I won't go through, except to say that there was a section on pursue happiness, which was covering ethics, kind of an overview of ethics, the history of ethics, the meta ethics, where we explain why life has to be the basis of values, and then a chapter on values and a chapter on virtue. And then it was only the last part of the book that I thought, okay, well, now I'm going to bring in like how to honor the self. And then I'm going to cover egoism. I'm going to cover relationships as a crucial way to honor the self, and art, because both of those things are very much about tapping into your deepest values. And as I was working on it this week, I realized that that was actually a confusing way to deal with things. So, first of all, like leaving egoism hanging till the very end of the book was confusing, in part because it comes out somewhat when you're just giving the grounding of values and facts, but also because it emphasized the wrong aspects of art and relationships, or that's not exactly the right way to put it. Rather, I thought there was a better way of bringing out the role of art and relationships in human life. So, what I realized was, all right, the section on pursuing happiness, which comes after free will in the book, that is going to give us the whole overview of ethics, values, virtues, and egoism. And at the end, what we're really talking about is the idea of not honoring the self. That's not the focus. Rather, the focus is on nurturing your soul. So a bunch of topics that I was being on one chapter really were going to be broken up into three. And the the first, and so just to give an outline or sketch of it, um under honor yourself, the first section is tentatively titled Seek Perfection, the second Refuel Your Spirit, and the third Love Deeply. And the the thing I want to pause on and go into is a little bit of how I'm setting all of this up. And so this chapter on seek perfection is really raising, I think, a crucial point that's going to be in the minds of most people when they're considering um, the whole case for a morality of happiness. And it's an argument you've undoubtedly heard. I thought it was most eloquently put forward by, of all people, Matthew McConaughey, the actor. And so this is what Matthew says. He said at one point, happiness is an emotional response to an outcome. If I win, I will be happy. If I don't, I won't. It's an if then cause and effect quid pro quo standard that we cannot sustain because we immediately raise it every time we attain it. And he goes on to make some other points, but it's this idea that, well, look, happiness is a chimera because every time we achieve a value, every time we achieve a goal, it's not as great as we thought it would be. And immediately our mind is focused not on how wonderful it is to have achieved this goal, it's focused on the next goal that we want to achieve. And, there's something really right about that. That is, life is a process. It's a process of achieving values where the work of achieving values is never done. You've never achieved enough. Your life is never secure enough. You're never intelligent enough. You never have enough values. It's an ongoing and ambitious process. And then there becomes a real question of, okay, well, if we're always on to the next thing, then how are we supposed to enjoy life? And Ayn Rand talks about this in several places. So one place is in The Fountainhead, where towards the end, Winan asks Rourke, he says, was your life just like one steady stream where, like a typing exercise where it's all like at the same pace and the same level, or were there stops? And Rourke says there were stops. And in that context, he's talking about like kind of the events that you go, like, this is a real crucial moment in my life. And I don't think he's telling me exactly the same thing that I'm about to mention, but I think it's highly related, which is that life is a process, but life is also an end in itself. And so what people are really perceiving when they focus on this idea that, all right, well, it's on to the next goal, what they're really perceiving is, no, I need moments. I need moments throughout my life in an ongoing way where I experience the fact that this process is an end in itself. I need actual moments that I'm living through where it's like, this is worth living for its own sake. And so then the question becomes, well, what is that? What gives us that? Now, the broadest answer is pleasure. Pleasure is experienced as an end in itself, as rewarding in that moment of worth living for its own sake. And the crucial essay here to read is Nathaniel Branden's essay in The Virtue of Selfishness, The Psychology of Pleasure. Now, objectivism is speaking about pleasure. Brandon's speaking about pleasure in this context in the widest sense. So it's not just physical pleasure, but it's every kind of like real positive. And the idea is that in those moments, your experience is that this is worth living through for its own sake. And so, what a morality of happiness is going to give you is a long range trajectory to happiness, but it's also going to encourage you and indeed compel and say you need to seek out as much pleasure in the moment as possible without sacrificing the long range, because that's all you have. All you have is, if you want to put it this way, which is not exactly right, a succeeding series of moments. And so it's filling your life with moments that are worth living for their own sake, not because this is building a road to a greater future, though that's crucial. That's the backbone of achieving happiness and pursuing happiness. But it's like, this is worth living for its own sake. And so we can, and if you think about the attacks on pleasure, it's precisely taking pleasures that sacrifice the long range to the short range. So obviously, if you're listening to this, you're well aware that objectivism is about long range happiness. It's about taking into context the whole of your life and the whole of your lifespan. And yet the idea is that within that context, so long as you're not sacrificing the long range, you want to eke out every possible pleasure from the short range and the highest possible pleasures. And so that's really what this section then goes on to talk about, which is the two highest pleasures, the two highest ends in themselves experiences that we can have. And that is art, or as I'm putting it for reasons that we'll get into in a minute, um, aesthetic experience, and then human relationships. So, one second, because I want to pull up something real quick. So, in the section art, again, my goal is not to recapitulate everything in objectivism that's worth knowing, but the section on art is really about what value art provides and how to get the most out of it. The the central idea here, and you can see now how Ayn Rand is really addressing exactly the point I just mentioned. So in the Romantic Manifesto, she says, since a rational man's ambition is unlimited, since his pursuit of achievement of values is a lifelong process, and the higher the values, the harder the struggle, he needs a moment, an hour, or some period of time in which he can experience the sense of his completed task, the sense of living in a universe where his values have been successfully achieved. It is like a moment of rest, a moment to gain the fuel to move further. And she goes on to make the point that that is what's given to you by art. And part of what I'm stressing here is it's not just art. Art is kind of in many ways the um, it's the most focused on the idea of a completed task of living in your ideal world. And so that's really what I'm going to give people is the idea of art as spiritual fuel. So there's going to be, I think, likely some of the role of art in terms of its survival value is what Ayn Rand calls the psychoepistemology of art. That is, it brings our deepest abstractions and puts them in concrete form. Um, but the focus is really on that this then provides emotional fuel. And so how do you get it? And so a lot of what I want to talk about is this. There's popular entertainment, and it's wrong ultimately to think about a dichotomy between entertainment and art. But if you think about popular entertainment, it's in effect easily digestible aesthetics. It's the sugar of aesthetics. And that's not a bad thing. Like I love pop music, I love hip hop, I love rock. If I love TV and movies, and not just like the deep thoughtful ones to the extent that those arrive in the scene every few years. Like all of that stuff is amazing, but the point is that you can even have something greater. It just requires a greater investment. And part of what I want to talk about is the people who taught me how to invest. So part of the difference between popular entertainment and what is often called like so-called serious art is that with serious art, you have to do work in order to get value out of it. And it's not obvious how to do that work. I certainly didn't know it. I was never taught it. And I had to learn that. So, in the realm of literature, the main people that I learned it from was Leonard Peikoff in his Eight Great Plays lecture course, and Lisa Van Dam in, well, everything that she's ever said to me, and every public lecture that she's ever given, and in her Read With Me course. And so that there's this process that you can go through that requires mental effort, that requires the use of free will. So again, it's tied into the idea that man is self-made and that we make ourselves through the way that we use our mind. This is going to be integrated with that way to use your mind to get value out of art, more value than you thought possible. And so it's to give people some indication of that kind of process. And so it'll be an interesting question that I'm still struggling with of how deep to go, because obviously it can't be a whole, 100-page manual on how to do this, but I at least want to give people some of the essentials so that they can see the possibility that, yeah, there's things I can do to really gain value out of art and make it part of my life and have these experiences that are ends in themselves. Um, It's not, however, just an issue of art, and this is one of the, I think, very new points, and here I have to credit, a guy named Cody Mork, who's an objectivist you probably haven't heard of, but he's developed some really interesting thinking along these lines, where he thinks that and argues quite compellingly that this aesthetic experience where we're able to pull meaning out of things that concretize our deepest views of the world. This is experiences that we can get throughout our lives, not just with art, though that's its most powerful form because it's fully selective, but that in our experiences with nature and our experiences with any form of contemplating things in the world and how they can concretize values. And one way to see this is if you read any novelist, any first or even second rate novelist, a lot of what a novelist is doing is taking things in the character's world and pulling out meaning from them, seeing something more and deeper and wider in them, whether it's, the feel of a cool fall breeze, whether it is a, to take a cliche, a kid helping an old lady across the street, whether it is, if you think of Ayn Rand's work, the meaning of New York City. And it's that is a process of contemplation. And like art, you're extracting a deep meaning from it. You're extracting a meaning that goes to your core values. And that is something that we don't do automatically. And yet it's something that gives us an experience in that moment of life as an end in itself. And so there's a lot I want to say about that in the book, but I just wanted to touch on it here, that this idea of going through life and actively working to see pieces of your ideal world, whether it's in art or just the daily encounters that you have in life. That's part of the way that we get from away from the hedonic treadmill of life is just only a process. And we see life both as a process and as something with stops. So that's on art. I also want to talk about, in addition to Lisa, I'm going to give one more example. Obviously, I would really like to do music, but nobody yet has really given me a method to listen to music that I found useful, and so I just don't have a lot to say about it. Um, I do have a book by an objectivist whose name, unfortunately, is escaping me now, and I apologize, uh, that I think is really promising, but it's just not a field that I can really speak to, though music is aside, or alongside literature, my favorite form of art. But then the other one is the visual arts. And here, full credit goes to my friend Luke Travers, who in 2000, I forget which, I guess it would have been 2009, there was a Objectivist Summer Conference in Boston. And I ended up going on an art tour led by Luke, whom I knew only a little bit at this point. And my experience with visual art was always walking around going, "Yeah, that's okay." Like it did not affect me at all. And yet he had this process where he would lead you step by step, starting with the idea of just look, what do you see? And just pointing out things you see, not trying to extract some theme, not trying to judge the art, but just what do you see? And building and building and building until I remember standing in front of the painter's honeymoon in awed reverence. And it was one of the most powerful aesthetic experience I ever had. And what was phenomenal though was there's a huge value, and indeed one of the tactics I'm going to talk about in this chapter is the value of finding great tour guides, whether through literature, through art, through music. But he had an explicit process that anybody could go through on their own that empowered them to create these experiences for themselves. And so that's what I want to share with people. So we'll focus, I think, on literature and on visual arts. I wish we could do music. I've thought of doing poetry, but as much as in many ways poetry's one of my favorite arts, um, I just have not really delved into it enough to be speaking with any seriousness about it or any authority on it. So, maybe I'll throw out a few tidbits there, but that's kind of the vision, right? Is you want to get people to see like art is going to help you gain these stops in your life. And here's how to get that value out of art. And I think that'll be a really cool thing. I think it's part of what makes this book unique is that like you don't expect a if you want to put it into a category that it doesn't quite belong to, you wouldn't expect a self-help book to talk about art. And yet I think that is so crucial to the pursuit of happiness. And I think it is one of the things that's uniquely powerful about objectivism. So then on to relationships. And I don't have much to say here except for I'll just name a couple things. So Brandon and Rand both point out that the highest forms of pleasure that human beings experience in general come from the realms of art and sex. And so in relationships, I want to talk about obviously romantic relationships, though I also want to spend some time on things that I don't think get discussed in objectivist nonfiction enough. So one is friendship. Now, Aristotle spends a lot of time on friendship and has a lot of, I think, really valuable insights to offer into friendship. But I want to tackle that quite a bit because I think um, there's so much to say on it. It's so vital for happiness. And certainly, I can't imagine my life without the kind of friendships that I built up, certainly over my adult life. The other thing I want to spend more time on is children. And Robert Mayhew had a really, I think, powerful point, and I'm almost hesitant to bring it up because I don't remember exactly what he said. But essentially, he puts romance and having children in the same category in terms of the profundity of the values. And that I definitely agree with. And so that's something that I need to do a lot more thinking, but I want to include and explore because I don't think that there's been sufficient discussion in anything in the objectivist literature on the value of children. And I mean, certainly reflecting on my life, that's been an extraordinary top value that and cannot be equaled. But then the one last point that I'll make that I think you might find interesting is all right, well, what's going to be the final thing covered in the book? And as I'm thinking right now, it's going to be the section on sex. And if you watched my OPAR video on this topic, part of what I brought out was how extraordinarily distinctive the objectivist view is. And I mean, I somewhat overstated it, but only a tiny bit when I said, in effect, like the reward for morality is great sex. And so I really want to elevate it in this book as like this is if you want to think about a symbol of why be moral, toss aside the religious garbage and the repressed like self-sacrificing nonsense that we're fed and the hero who has to give up his love for the greater good and no virtue morality, it's all about gray sex. Again, I'm overstating it a little, but I want to drive that point forward. Uh, and in part, I want to drive it forward because it is so distinctive and it gets across like this is not your grandmother's morality. There's a temptation to present objectivism as well. If I make it sound like common sense and what everybody else believes, like, hey, no, like we believe in helping people and doing what's good for others, but it's just not sacrificing. Da, da. There's a time and a place for that, and there's a certain legitimacy to that. But in the end, like, no, this is calling for a completely different way of life than we've been taught. And I think nothing illustrates that more than by elevating this thing that has been damned or at least fastened with guilt elevating it to the highest, noblest activity that human beings can engage in. So that's kind of where my mind has been, is in really working out this idea of how do you get the most out of life spiritually, get the most out of life now, today, not in some abstract, oh, I'm working towards some great future, but hey, yeah, keep building a better and better future. But God damn it, like you need to enjoy yourself today. And how do you do that without falling into hedonism or anything like that? I think that is for my money, that's the way to end the book and to stress the spiritual nature of selfishness in a way that in Rand's fiction, I think it is definitely stressed, though in the nonfiction, I don't think it's stressed as much. So that's kind of where my thinking is on that. Let me see if there's anything else that I wanted to say on that. All right, so that's all I had on the book. Let's dive into a couple issues that have come up this week. Jacob says incredible stuff. I can't wait to read this book. Yeah, well, I'm working hard and fast, and hopefully, the first half of next year is my personal goal. Though we'll see. I'm not gonna over rush this. All right. So let's see what we got here. Oh, I should say, I'm gonna have an extra show this week. I'm not gonna do it live because I haven't figured out the intricacies of how to do different things live. But I'm gonna have an interview coming up this week, and probably will intersperse some interviews in between the Thursday show. I think I'm gonna keep the Thursday show mainly just me riffing on things that I'm thinking about during the week. But stay tuned for that. This particular interview show, I don't want to give too much away, but I'm going to be talking to somebody about their own writing career. And so, if there's anything that you would want me to help you with in terms of your communication goals, and you'd be willing to do it in the form of a podcast interview, um, basically, you have two choices if you want to deal with me. One is you can pay me uh, a significant amount of money, or we can do it publicly for free. So just have that on your radar screen. Here's a question that is right up the alley of the last section of the book. So I said that the first section is going to be on perfection because I focused in our comments so far in the idea that okay, happiness is about seeking pleasure now, but then it has to get into what is pleasure. It's not just physical pleasure, and ultimately, our deepest pleasures are tapping into our deepest core beliefs, our deepest values. And so, in order to nurture that, part of what you have to do is earn a soul that can really achieve deep pleasure. And so, that's the whole issue of pride, self esteem, and perfection. So, that's going to be key to the first of the last three chapters. So, this is a question that comes via a YouTube comment, and it says, I've been struggling with the concept of perfection lately. I can't get past the thought that it implies that there's an ethereal template out there one must adhere to be perfect. Jesus for Christians, for example. So I've been relying more and more on the concept of ideal, which can be tailored to each individual and still be valid. Two people can be their ideal self and can differ wildly. What are your thoughts on the subject? Well, I think that's a really good question. I think you're right, and people are right to be bothered by the idea of perfection. But if we stop back and think, perfection just means that you fulfilled a standard of value. It means that here's the the standard of what we're trying to achieve, and you've met it. And if you met it, that's perfection. And so in that sense, there's nothing wrong with the word perfect, though it does have a lot of connotations that um are problematic. So one is you stress the issue of individuality. And yes, it's very true that like what morality gives you is an abstract standard. It's the standard that applies to all human beings at all times in all ways. And so it's easy to view that then as it's it's something that's remote from me in some way or some way that's agnostic to me and my particular values. And that's definitely something I'm going to talk a lot about in the book is that, morality gives you these kind of abstract standards that shape your life, but they have to be filled in with the personal values that are contextualized to your life and that are uniquely you. But if we're talking about moral perfection, it means you've met the basic shape of a life. Now, even there, I don't like to think of perfection. So I think and if you read Ayn Rand in Causality versus Duty, it's very funny because she seems in a certain way, there seems to be a tension between what she says there and what she says in Galt's speech when she talks about the virtue of pride. The virtue of pride, she gets that it's a moral person places nothing above their own moral perfection. And yet in Causality versus Duty, she's talking about the way in which it's a Kantian who's totally focused on their moral character and not their values. So there's a lot to say on that. And I don't know that off the top of my head, I'll have the kind of like most incisive rip. But let me say this much. I don't think about perfection as there's this thing out there I have to live up to. And if I fall short, like I'm garbage. I think about it much more as an issue of perfecting. That is, what I think the objectivist ethics is really pushing against is settling. What it's saying is not, look, you should whip yourself, lash yourself, prostrate yourself if you have any moral flaws. No. What it's saying is that you should never settle for them. It's saying that, all right, you can't exactly put this in mathematic terms, but let's do it just to illustrate the point. Let's say you got 10 failings that you really want to overcome. And what eh, what the issue of perfection is stressing is that not, well, you better cure them overnight or you're doomed to become Kant or something like that. What it's stressing is that, well, all right, once you've worked on one and all right, now, you know what? I'm way more willing to s- be honest about my beliefs, tell people I'm an atheist, even when there's social pressure. Once you've gotten that, you've conquered that. What it's saying is, all right, we'll keep going, that you should never resign yourself to any moral flaws or moral failings. Keep perfecting is what it's saying. Keep improving. Never say I've done enough or I can't fix this thing that's a matter of choice. And I think that's the perspective that is crucially important. It's the idea that you have a choice of what's your trajectory. Are you continually striving to get better or are you letting yourself become worse? And that's really what I think the virtue of pride is about. It's not, there's the standard of perfection that's handed down by morality, and I either am all in or all out. Now, there is a perspective from which a single moral flaw insulated from judgment, accepted, if you evade the implications of an immorality, that over time, over the long run, that evasion can't be contained and you end up becoming worse and worse. That is certainly true. And Peikoff talks about that in Opar. But I think that's a very different issue from what we're talking about here, which is what we're talking about is your attitude towards flaws. It's not if you have them, you're doomed. It's, are you working on fixing them or are you settling? Jose says, it has always bothered me as an adult that humility is a dominating goal for most. Oh, and earlier he says humility is transient at best. It's a transfer station before you seek your pride, moral perfection, including improving errors and mistakes. Yeah, I definitely am going to talk about humility because I think it's very interesting, and I haven't worked out exactly what my thoughts are on it. So take this for what it's worth. But I think humility is a package deal, um, and at least so far now, and I haven't looked closely to the etymology, so I might change this, and maybe I even got it completely backwards. I think that there is a good thing that people are trying to get at with humility that's better captured by modesty. So, look, we've all met like the jackass who just thinks like, "Yeah, I'm awesome. I can't make mistakes," and like they're kind of evading the limits of their knowledge and the limits of their ability. And nobody likes that. And it um and it's really self-destructive because you're in effect governed by blind spots. Whereas modesty I think of as realism in regard to your strengths and weaknesses. So humility I view as denying your strengths or apologizing for your strengths or thinking, "Oh, there's something wrong with having confidence in what's good in me and where I am strong and where I am able and capable." And modesty I think of as um a rational evaluation of my strengths and weaknesses. And I think that that kind of modesty is good. The way I've put it in other times is that um, if I was going to design somebody, I think that being arrogant when you're young is probably a strength. And the way I've talked about it is, look, if you think about somebody who's going to like say, I'm going to take on the world, I'm going to build a career, people are going to read my books, people are going to want to see me on TV, they're going to hear what I have to say. I should build a company, I should create a product, I should change the future. And you don't have a track record yet, I think you have to be little bit arrogant. So like let's just make it arbitrary completely. Until you're 28, there's nothing wrong with being a little arrogant. But what should happen as you grow is you realize, okay, yeah, I really do have certain strengths and I really have achieved certain things. But then you'll also recognize your limits, your blind spots. And that I think leads to modesty. And so my view is that modesty is a concomitant of self-esteem. It's the recognition that I'm basically competent to cope with the challenges of reality. That's the self, and it's to recognize that in specific areas of reality, I have certain strengths and weaknesses, and I know what those are to a large extent. Um, that's how I'm thinking about it currently. That will very likely change, if not in essence, at least in detail, as I write the book and think those issues through more. But I think, yeah, I think it's super interesting. And look, this is an example of why I wanted to write this book because people find humility like, there's a real reason why they think it's good, and it's not just altruism. If it was just like, you should sacrifice, no, there's a real plausibility to it, and so this book is really trying to reconceptualize all of these crucial issues in life so that a person can see, yes, this is the right framework to think in, and my framework that I've been brought up in, has certain things that are plausible, but they don't hold up when pushed. Let's see. Jose says, "Do you believe that most businessmen do not see pride the way that you or we do, or entrepreneurs?" Um, I don't think you can universalize, and even when they see it, quote, the way I do, it's not as refined. It has certain misconceptualizations and things built into it. But I would say there's definitely a lot of business people and entrepreneurs who have, in essence, the right view of that. It's like self confidence in your ability to deal with reality. But it's, you know, n- they don't have clean conceptual structures. And that's again, that's why this book is necessary. It's because I want to take those people and give them that framework so that they can go on and live their lives. And it's not undercut in the ways that things are if you just swallow stuff from the culture. Even if you're critically thinking about the culture, if you don't have a philosophy and the guide of a philosopher to help you, it's really easy to make mistakes. Jacob says, I was just talking about humility yesterday. Sometimes people think I'm humble because I don't express my achievements in a way that I'm trying to impress or impose a higher status. Yeah, no, I think that's true. I mean, look, the people who tout their achievements is almost always an issue of low self-esteem. Ayn Rand has this great line, and I wish I could remember where it was, where she makes this point and she says, but like if somebody, challenges, who are you to do XYZ, the man of self-esteem tells them. And so and you can see this in her own interviews. It's that if people compliment her, she doesn't go, "Oh shucks, no, I'm not that great." She says, "That's right. Your novel is the best XYZ." Yes, that's true. It's a matter of fact acknowledgement of things that are good about herself, but she's not the one going around boasting. And that's the difference. I think it's you're not concerned with status games if you have self-esteem, but you certainly aren't going to fear acknowledging your successes and your virtues and your strengths. And if somebody points them out, then yeah, you'll say, "Yeah, that's true." And that's powerful. Ellen Kenner, who's a prominent objectivist psychologist, she says that it was precisely that about Ayn Rand that really struck her watching Donahue, was that kind of self-esteem and acknowledging her own value and own abilities. So I think it is really powerful, and it's so you very rarely see that. Um, it's humbleness is, at least in lip service, we value it, and to some extent, we really value it because it's such a nice change from the jerk who's not all that good saying how good he is. A couple other things that I have, and feel free, you guys, to ask questions in the chat. Um, Well, so I did a workshop. I have a weekly workshop with the Ayn Rand Center UK where we help people with their communication challenges. And if you want to be part of that, all you have to do is become a monthly donor of, I think, like $10 or more to me or to ARC UK and ask for admissions to it. And you'll get personalized feedback on your stuff and you'll see me give personalized feedback to others. But one of the things that we did is we did a mock Q&A with one of the participants, and one of the issues that came up was the issue of charisma. And I just wanted to throw one thought out there because look, I do believe that charisma is, it's not a very well defined thing, but if we just take it as that there's a certain magnetism that people seem to have, um I think if you're trying to build a large audience, it is a real phenomenon that some people you just want to watch and you're fascinated by. And there's probably good analyses of the components of it, and I wanna say this, which is that if you're not charismatic and you don't think that you can become that way, like, it's not hopeless, and so I had a tweet that went out today and went out as part of my newsletter basically saying, "If you're not charismatic, just become really good at helping people get what they want." And I know a lot of you are writers, and let me say this, a writer does not have to be charismatic at all. Indeed, some of the best writers with the largest followings are just really good writers. But when they talk, when they appear in front of an audience, when they're doing interviews, it doesn't come through. And look, that's a weakness. But the point is that if you're helping people get what they want, including illumination or entertainment or emotion from your writing or something, um, then you can go a long way with that. And so it's I think it's true that this is a real factor. Like if you're trying to design the ultimate intellectual, yeah, you're going to stick charisma in there and you need to be honest with yourself about your own goals. Like, look, I do not think I'm going to have a YouTube channel and like speaking tour that's going to get 30,000 people packed in to see it. Like, I just don't have that, or at least that's my own personal estimate. So, I if I think about what is my main channel, what is my main platform, it's writing. So there's just this wider issue in life. Gary Vaynerchuk calls it self-awareness, and I think that's a good term. But it's an idea of like I know what I want, I know what I'm good at, I know what I'm not good at, and then I'm not going to fool myself, but I'm going to use that whole mix to get the things that I want in life. And so as a movement, there's a good conversation to had about like, look, if you don't have charisma, don't it, you're probably not going to solve the problem about how to bring in masses of people to objectivism unless you're like a killer writer or something. Um, there is a real issue of that. But for you as an individual, it's just okay. That means like my my path to success is not going to be standing in front of an audience and holding them in rapt attention for 90 minutes at a time. So I wanted to throw that out there for what it's worth. Well, some of this I'll hold off on since we're getting close to the end. But I will say this in terms of strengths and weaknesses, I definitely have long been aware of, but now have really become focused on what I think is my biggest weakness as a fiction writer and particularly a screenwriter, which is something I want to do. Which is the issue of I am not widely read in fiction. And like even in my genre that I'm writing in of thrillers, I'm not widely read. Like, I mean, I've read something, but I've always felt that reading fiction was like not doing anything useful. It's like, oh, well, I could do something useful long term, like read this book on philosophy, or I could indulge and read, you know, a well, what am I reading now? Don Winslow's, I'm gonna go blank. The Power of the Dog. Read these things that are just fun, and if not fun, they're interesting and thrilling to read. But there's this quote from Stephen King, and I've heard it a number of times, but it really punched me in the nose this week, which was like, if you don't have time to read, you don't have time or the material to write. And so I've really taken that seriously. And as I start thinking about and planning the follow up to the first novel that I've written, I Am Justice, I've taken seriously that, all right, I really need to sit down and do my homework and make like part of my workday is I need to spend an hour reading something in my genre. Ideally, something good in my genre, but sometimes something bad because you learn a lot by reading bad writers. Indeed, sometimes you can read more by reading bad writers because it really brings to the surface, oh, I don't want to do that. And indeed, I've had that even in nonfiction, particularly in nonfiction. I've talked about this in various ways where it's reading objectivist writers who I thought were not convincing and not interesting. I thought, oh, well, yeah, now I see the flaw. Now I see the problem. So you want to mix, but the idea is that no, this has to be a core part of my workday. Now, this is such a great result, right? Like, I don't know why I've resisted it for so long. If somebody came along to you and said, hey, Bill, look, whatever you're working on, I need you to make sure that you spend an hour like reading your favorite genre of fiction. Like, I have to think that most people would be like, well, hell yeah. But for whatever reason, I've resisted it. But now that is my main mission. So, squeezing in at least an hour a day to delve into these things, and I think, and I should note, I don't just read them. Like, so right now, like I said, I'm reading Don Winslow's Power of the Dog, and I don't know how well you can see this, but like I mark this up as much as I do nonfiction, just trying to figure out like, all right, what is he doing and how is he doing it and what's working and what's not. So, uh, if you're a writer, I highly recommend that. And, if you're just a reader, become a writer and you have an excuse to do that. So Andrew says, I thought your Ocon Q&A was particularly good and you came off as both really engaging and charismatic. So who knows, you could eventually be the next Sam Harris or Jordan Peterson. Keep perfecting. I like that, Andrew. Well, look, I think if I have a strength, I was talking to somebody about this earlier today. It's that I'm really interested in like just trying things for the fun of them. So during Ocon, I spent a day doing some really bizarre tweeting. That was really what I was trying to do was troll the people who were not smart enough to attend Ocon. So, for instance, I think my friend Jean Maroney was giving a talk, and so I tweet like, Jean gives her 3 best rules for how to form your purpose. Great ideas, and then people would be like, well, what are the ideas? And so it's stuff that was like, there's no formal purpose to it, but it's to amuse me. And my point is not that these are the things that are charismatic or something, but I think it's that kind of mindset that, like, I'm doing something very, very different from any other objectivist intellectual because it just comes from me and how I want to operate in the world. And I think that's a big part of charisma is that you get the sense of a distinct individual. If you've ever seen interviews with Ayn Rand, you get the idea of like, this is a one of a kind individual. And I'm not comparing myself to her, certainly in terms of like, earth shaking genius. But if you take somebody who is able to communicate ideas in a way that's genuinely helpful to people, and that they do it in a way that is very filled with who they are, that they're not just a mouthpiece for somebody who lived, you know, 40 years ago. Those two things are super powerful. You get because I've said this again and again, you guys are probably sick of it. Thanks, Robert. You guys are probably sick of it, but yeah, I believe it to the core of my bones that people are not convinced by ideas. They're convinced by people who embody and advocate ideas. And so you can't just be a mouthpiece. I mean, you can if you want to be a teacher. A teacher who understands a set of ideas and can help you understand them, that is a wonderful yeah, Gene, that's my cat. One of two. But a teacher can do that. But if your goal is to actually like build an audience and build a mass following, it has to be more than that. It has to be that people look up and say, I want to be like you in some respect. Maybe as a full person, maybe just as a thinker, it there really has to be an aspect of emulation built into it, and people don't wanna emulate a mouthpiece. They don't wanna emulate somebody who's just, like, normal, maybe has some good arguments. They wanna emulate somebody who's incredibly distinctive, and look, being distinctive is not about, like, just trying to, like, "Oh, let me be original." It's just, no, you really start with, "Who am I? How do I wanna live in the world? How do I wanna advocate ideas?" And so, for me, it means like bringing out certain parts of my personality. And there's a reason people don't do that. It's risky. I mean, you have to remember, I'm at Ocon. Nobody knows what the hell I'm doing, and like I have to face, you're on Brook the next day, and thankfully, he's an awesome guy. But he says, "So am I the only one you make fun of?" Based on what I was tweeting, and like people I respect going, "What are you doing?" And a lot of us are so afraid. We're so afraid that we're going to be judged, particularly by people we respect. And look, I want to be judged positively by the people I respect. But at the end of the day, the most important thing is that I want to put myself out there, and that includes my ideas. And yeah, I learned most of my ideas from Ayn Rand, but they're my ideas. I've internalized them, I use them, and they're intermingled with a whole bunch of ideas I didn't learn from her, and at least kind of like, formulations that I find uniquely clarifying. So I do think, and I appreciate the compliment. I do think, there's certain things that I'm doing that if you want to put them under the umbrella of charisma, I think of them under the umbrella of authenticity and being an individual. And that I think is the kind of thing that gives you the potential to build a mass audience. But look, you have to have an amazing toolkit. You have to actually intellectual toolkit. You have to actually be able to help people. You have to actually be able to clarify issues. There's a lot of hard work that goes into it, but there's an added part of it. And that added part is you. What's distinctively you? Jose says you were very funny, surprisingly funny, though Justice is funny. Justice is the character in my novel, the main character. Yeah, a lot of people, I mean, thankfully not my best friends, but a lot of people said they were surprised by the sense of humor of the novel. And I mean, that's fair. It usually doesn't come out, if you're denouncing inequality alarmists who are trying to like slaughter successful people, there's not as much humor mixed in there. But humor has been a top value for me. I mean, this week was really hard for me, surprisingly. So my top favorite living comedian, if you follow me on Twitter, you've probably heard this, uh, is Norm Macdonald, and unfortunately, he's no longer my top favorite living comedian because he's not living anymore. He passed away from cancer this week. And thankfully, I got to see him in person while he was still alive. But like comedy is, I wouldn't quite put it as a top value. It's, it's not up there with objectivism or something like that, but it's a very high value for me. I just love, I think, first of all, it's just really fun to laugh. And I just really admire what it takes. Look, I'm a public speaker, and I've said this a million times, but if you are a public speaker on a serious topic and you say like something that's 2% funny, the audience just like roars with uproarious laughter. It's this nice release. But look, I cannot imagine going up on a stage and people are sitting there, arms crossed, and their whole attitude is not, all right, I want to learn a lot. Oh, he made me laugh too. It's, dude, you better make me laugh. Who can do that? I mean, that is something. So I have just such an enormous admiration for it. But so, which is to say that, I mean, certainly part of how I view myself is I have a sense of humor. It's a weird sense of humor. So hopefully, it's good to know that it's shared by some people. Um, that, but I mean, that's one of the reasons I wanted to write a novel is I get to bring more of myself into the world. I mean, that was frankly, it's one of the hard parts about working at an institution was that you're representative of that institution, and that's proper. It's proper that as somebody who works for the Ayn Rand Institute, you represent the Ayn Rand Institute. Um, but it also means that, like, well, look, it's not some of your personality has to get left out of it. Oh, wow. All right, Gene Walters, I have to take a moment to say this. So I've just got monetization on YouTube, and my very first super chat of all time comes from Gene Walters. He says, or she, I'm sorry, Gene, I don't know which. Sorry if I missed it. How do you choose what other fiction to read? Was it based on other works in the same genre you're working on? Yeah, I'll answer that in a second. But anyway, just to close the previous thought, yeah, just one of the reasons I wanted to be independent was that it gave me the opportunity to like really bring me into existence. All right, Gene is a guy. I really apologize for that. I mean, I guess I should have guessed from the spelling, but you never know. So Gene, in terms of choosing what fiction to read, so I mean, there's a lot of fiction I want to read, frankly, but in terms of what I regard as work right now, one day I'm probably going to write. Uh, I mean, you shouldn't even put it this way, but like a serious novel or probably a more philosophic novel someday. But right now, my genre is thrillers, though I try to inject ideas into them and put intellectual depth into them. So I want something in that genre or closely aligned. So Stephen King is somebody who, I mean, he's not my sense of life, to put it mildly, but I really admire him as a writer in terms of somebody who can build tension, who can sustain interest. And particularly, he's good at something that I think is really hard, which is a slow build. So, like, um, I kind of like, I'm going to grab you by the neck with my novel and keep things moving really fast throughout it, obviously, with the ups and downs and pacing that you need. But he's somebody who he knows what he's doing, and so he's perfectly happy to just slowly let out the fishing line and reel you in piece by piece. So people like that I'm interested in reading as well. But I mean, basically, I don't have like a specific method except that I want to. There's two things that I'm very interested in. One is who are the best people in the field, and that doesn't necessarily mean the most popular, but I want to know who are the best writers. So I've said Terry Hayes' I Am Pilgrim, I think is the best thriller that I've ever read in terms of the quality, the plot, the characters, the writing. Don Winslow is, I think, quickly becoming one of my top favorites. This is the first book of his I've read, but it's just so well researched, so real. So the writing is so brilliant. Another person I really like, and I can't believe that I'm going blank on his name at the moment. All right, hold on. We have to fix this because how can I not? How can I be going blank on one of my favorite writers' names? But that's what happens when you're speaking live. Elmore Leonard. So for those of you who don't know, he wrote the novel that the movie Get Shorty was based on, the TV show Justified was based on, and he's really incredible. So people like that who are at the top of the game. Um, the guy, another name I always forget, but the guy who writes the Jack Reacher novels, uh, Leo's Tales asks, "Have you read Mickey Spillane? Any Mickey Spillane?" I've tried. I have a collection of his books, but this the the genre has changed. At some point, I have to just because they are classics, and classics are worth reading. But the genre has changed so much that it's um, for what I'm trying to do. It's not necessarily as valuable and important, but I've read a little of him, but I've never completed any of his books. So I want to someday, but it's not as high on my priority as more kind of the modern people. In part because I'm really trying to build an audience um, today, and so I want to know a lot about their expectations. But look, I'm not completely parochial. I get that there were great writers in the past. I've read some of them. I mean, I grew up on Robert Parker, who is his detective fiction is uh, like you can't you can't top his dialogue. And in part, I think part of it, I got my sense of humor from him. He was one of my early influences on that front. But but no, Mickey Splain, I don't have any real. I've never read any of his novels completely. But then the other category, so those are kind of the top people, the best people. But then the other category I was gonna say is the top people. So the top people are gonna be people who I don't think are that great, but they have a huge audience, and I just wanna understand what's grabbing audiences today. So, like, I read, The Girl on the Train. I read, some, oh, shoot, what's his name? James Patterson books and things. And that's more just like, know where the market is, but I actually put a lot of that stuff in stuff I don't want to do, like lessons on what not to do. Like there's some stuff there to do because they do some stuff obviously well, but yeah. Fab says any other popular genres you like? Not really. I like individual novels. So like there's a few sci-fis that I like Ender's Game. Um, there's what else? I'm wrapping kind of mystery and thriller, suspense, horror all into one category in terms of what I like. Um, but like I haven't read any westerns, I don't think. Maybe there's stuff in there I would like. I haven't read any romance. Um, this isn't exactly a genre, but I have read some YA that I think are for what they are kind of interesting. Um, But no, in general, like, for me, it's thrillers or serious fiction. That's more how I roll, and, you know, I somebody at Ocon was basically saying, "Look, if you really wanna get ideas across, write sci-fi," and I was like, "Well, you write it." I get it. I get that it's a great format, but in part, if you've read my novel and if you ultimately read my novel, you realize my goal is not to proselytize. That is not why I'm writing fiction. I'm writing fiction to give you a thrilling, exciting experience, a stimulating experience, and above all, an emotional experience. And, if ideas come through, that's great. I, I am who I am. I'm not going to be able to write without something philosophic. But I just I don't respond to science fiction very much, and so I just can't. Oh, Chandler, I love I Am Justice. Almost done. Thank you so much. Look, eh, I've gotten a lot of the only compliment that matters for an author The only compliment that matters is I couldn't put it down. Or if not that, at least I finished the book and I liked it. But anything short of I finished the book is a criticism. And not because, like, look, I get it. People have priorities, and even if we think a book is pretty good, we can like set it down. But here's the thing. If a book is really good, you sacrifice your other values for it. I remember with I Am Pilgrim, I stayed up till 3:30 in the morning in a work night reading it, not because I thought this would be good for my work day, but because it was, no, this is all that matters, is I have to know what happened. There's a book about the guy who wrote Girl with a Dragon Tattoo and some real life espionage stuff he was part of that led to his death. Oh, I'll have to check that out. I started his book. I haven't read it. His is a slow burn, but I mean it's a modern classic according to many people, and he's a good writer. I can tell that even from like the first third of it. Um, I didn't know that. Yeah, I mean the hard thing is that if you're really trying to compete in the big leagues, is that many of the people writing were in the military, were in law enforcement, some of them, even like CIA and like all these things. And so, like, there's a reason why I picked a hero who was the technical term is amateur detective, even though she's not exactly a detective. Um, it's precisely that I didn't have that background. So, like, I basically, in order to really compete at the highest levels, you have to be able to figure out how to get some real insider research. And thankfully, I have some friends who are in or were in the FBI, the DEA, things like that. But um, at a certain, I think with each novel, I'll really do more and more because I really do. Lakar, yeah, 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 definitely, Jose. Um, More and more research because I think you need that to really be able to have something that resonates with enough readers today. I don't think you can get away with some, Wikipedia. I mean, I did more than that for my book, but part of what goes on in the novel is the whole idea, or part of the idea for the series was, I always thought like, and maybe I've said this to you guys. I've always said like, how does a person become a Jack Reacher type hero? And so what I want to do is have this character evolve from this girl who's just like a college student into like a Jack Reacher type hero. And so like I in effect can like learn along with her and build up to that. She doesn't have to like, be a hardened, FBI agent of 2.5 decades, which is really good because I'm not a hardened FBI agent of 2.5 decades. All right. Vab says it was really cool reading the book with someone else, same single day pace. Oh, that's cool. All right, guys. It is 7:08 in my area, so I'm gonna sign off. Thanks everybody for showing up. I tune in next week where whatever is on my mind will once again parade across your screen, and really appreciate everything that you guys are doing to support my work. As always, the best way to stay in touch is to go to donswriting.com, sign up for the newsletter where you will get the latest information. And again, let me give a big shout out to our first super chat ever, Gene Walters. You're the man. You will always be remembered. Somebody turn that into an NFT, but don't sell it yet because it's not going to be worth anything probably for like another 5 to 10 years. But someday, lots of money. All right, guys, take care. Have a wonderful night. Talk to you next time.